So at the end, Canadians living in urban and suburban metropolitan regions face what we call an affordability paradox, where they must choose between either lower cost housing in suburban outskirts, where a lack of public transit means costly personal vehicle ownership, or they can choose more expensive housing in the urban core, where access to good public transit can potentially make automobile ownership unnecessary. So yes, I was saying urban sprawl is a key issue because it's in resolving the mobility and climate crisis. Because if we don't resolve this, then we're not giving people the financial means to have access to affordable housing, affordable transportations, and good jobs, as well as a strong, social relationships.
Hello, and welcome to Class and Climate, a podcast from the Green Economy Network and the Broadbent Institute, where we see how the end of the world meets the end of the month. I'm Nick Pierce. $12.6 billion. That's how much public transit saves Canadians from the cost of operating vehicles. And that's real money in the pockets of ordinary Canadians. But if you've ever been stuck outside waiting for a bus in the cold, you know that there are serious challenges facing Canada's transit systems. Those issues stem from underfunding, as well as Canada's piecemeal approach to the development of public transit, which relies too much on private sector actors that often fall short of serving ordinary Canadians. Fixing these issues to increase public transit use within communities will be key to cutting emissions in the transportation sector, but also for making life more affordable for Canadians. That's why the Green Economy Network's common platform calls for $82 billion in spending from all levels of government to fix mobility. That means revamped public transit systems within cities, but also high-speed rail projects between places like Windsor and Quebec City or Calgary and Edmonton. These services employ thousands of Canadians and prevent millions of tons of emissions from entering the environment. Investing in them is a cost-effective way to improve lives and create good jobs and reduce Canada's carbon footprint. That's why we have the perfect guest to talk about how mobility can make climate action deliver for ordinary Canadians. Blandine Sebileau is a sustainable mobility analyst from Equiterre, an organization in Quebec fighting for a necessary collective transition towards an equitable and environmentally sound future. Blandine Sebileau. How does someone commuting to work experience the climate crisis, and how might that look in the future if we don't change how we get around?
There are multiple ways by which someone traveling to work, for instance, can experience the climate crisis. First of all, they might experience, if we think about extreme events, such as heat waves, flooding, for instance, it's easy to understand and imagine how people, and I'm sure people listening to this podcast might already have experienced, how it feels to be traveling, walking, cycling to work during a heat wave situation, which is very difficult and uncomfortable, might lead to people choosing alternatives to commute to work or even stay at home. Flooding as well makes traditional routes unavailable in extreme conditions, such as violent storms. People might not be able to access their destination due to road cuts, electricity outage, for instance. In less extreme situations, we might experience disrupted or lack of services in public transit, for instance. We might experience worn-out infrastructures, roads, again, public transit infrastructures and equipments be broken, not functioning. And it might get increasingly difficult to maintain those infrastructures due to higher maintenance and supply costs of both transport infrastructure and equipment. So all of the above result in higher transportation fares, less money available to people as well to invest in the local economy, adapt to climate change, and survive in an increasingly difficult world. So adapting to climate change requires a lot of resources, and one of the key issues here is to make sure that people spend as little as possible on their transport needs so that they have those resources available to adapt to climate change. So how could it look in the future if we maintain the situation that we're in? And we're going to talk about this later, I think, and describe further what the issues are with mobility in general in Canada and around the world. In the future, it will be more complex, more and more complex getting around. Fewer choices in transportation modes as well, depending on the events that we've discussed, on extreme events, for example, and it might be more expensive. We're talking about higher fuel costs, for example, for people traveling by car. Yeah, the climate crisis might affect supply areas, which are crucial to the operation of our mobility systems, refueling, asphalt production, etc. And the most vulnerable and financially disadvantaged people will find it increasingly difficult to travel, to join loved ones, to access healthcare systems, or find a good job. These are just examples of trends of situation that we might experience in the future if we stay in a status quo.
That's really interesting. I guess on one hand, transportation and mobility can be a major source of emissions, but then on the other hand, mobility is also very vulnerable to dangerous weather and the impacts of climate change. If we could just go through a list, and you already sort of got to this, what are the major problems with how mobility works in Canadian cities today? If you could kind of just lay out the problems we need to fix.
We can talk about many issues with mobility today. There are different contexts, right? So there's the urban context and there's non-urban, more rural areas where, for instance, there's less public transit, so people are more dependent on their cars. In urban areas, we experience more and more traffic congestion, yes? So for people traveling by cars, Canadian cities are experiencing significant traffic congestion. So this leads to longer commute times, economic losses, and some cities have been able to quantify the cost of that congestion. In Montreal, for example, I think for 2023, the cost of congestion was estimated at $6 billion for the year. And if nothing is done to make this better, it will get to $10 billion by 2030. And it's the same in major cities, across Canada, across North America. We're talking about, again, economic losses for organizations and for people. We're talking about stress. We're talking about more money being spent in driving, because we're talking about more gas being wasted in congestion. So it's a situation which is not convenient for individual and has broad economic impacts. Another issue is we're going to talk about the urban sprawl as well later, but I can already touch on that because it has so many impacts on mobility and climate change. What happens is that with rapidly rising housing costs, which we experience across the country, these rising costs are pushing more and more urban Canadians to live in farther-flung suburbs in a process which is actually described as drive until you qualify. This has pushed low-income families into auto-dependent places that have worse public transit service and longer commutes. And it's led to greater social isolation, compounded social disadvantages, such as access to jobs, services, and opportunities. So limited public transit and car dependency is another issue in areas where people don't have access to public transit or where inadequate public transit is offered. People obviously rely on their cars. This is pushing them to move to cheaper suburban areas where housing is more affordable. But at the same time, their transportation costs, meaning gas, insurance, and maintenance, increase, which is actually offsetting housing savings that they're making by being pushed away from the urban center. So at the end, Canadians living in urban and suburban metropolitan regions face what we call an affordability paradox, where they must choose between either lower cost housing in suburban outskirts, where lack of public transit means costly personal vehicle ownership is a must, or they can choose more expensive housing in the urban core, where access to good public transit can potentially make automobile ownership unnecessary. So yes, I was saying urban sprawl is a key issue because it's in resolving the mobility and climate crisis. Because if we don't resolve this, then we're not giving people the financial means to have access to affordable housing, affordable transportations, and good jobs, as well as a strong, social relationships. Another maybe issue that I would talk about is that private vehicles keep getting larger and larger. So not only we're more depending on cars, private vehicles keep getting larger and larger. This is due to many factors, such as the advertising of larger vehicles that we're experiencing over the last decades. So another issue with mobility, which is actually key, and we're not seeing it only in Canada, but in North America and actually across the world. But it has very large impacts here in Canada in terms of our GHG emissions. And this is the rise of larger vehicles. We're talking about SUVs and pickup trucks mostly. Today, if anyone tries to find a small vehicle, well, it's a real challenge. Traditional cars have disappeared from car dealers, and soon they'll disappear off our roads too. And last year, I think it was something like 86% of all private vehicles, passenger vehicles sold in Canada were SUVs and pickup trucks. Manufacturers have decided to drive the market towards those larger vehicles rather than sedan traditional cars. This means that we're using more and more energy, whether it's gas or electricity, because electric vehicles are also getting bigger and bigger. So we're spending more and more energy on these vehicles, and they're having a huge effect on a negative effect on our efforts to reduce GHG emissions. If we just look at the GHG emissions generated by passenger vehicles in general between 1990 and 2018 in Canada, these emissions have risen by 156%, right? So this is a major problem in Canada that we're still grasping how much of an impact it has, but we're not tackling it at all. And this sector is contributing to rising, the emissions globally for Canada. So it's driving our emissions up by 21% over the period which I mentioned. And for people, what does it mean? It means that it's getting more and more difficult to find a vehicle which is affordable. These larger vehicles, they cost on average $10,000 more to buy and $4,000 more to maintain for gas, for insurance, maintenance costs each year than standard cars. This is really a major problem that we have to tackle, and for that we will need regulations. But it's a problem for cities as well, because these vehicles are taking up more and more spaces, parking space, more and more space on our roads, so they're contributing to the congestion that I talked about earlier. So I think it's a major problem that we need to tackle, especially when the cost of living, when inflation is already making people's life more and more difficult. We need to give them the means to be able to drive or commute to work, not only safely, but also it has to be affordable. Not everyone can buy a $70,000 car, and people living, again, outside cities or in suburban areas where little public transit service, they need affordable options to drive to their loved ones, to drive to work, to drive to healthcare. So it needs to be tackled, and we're not seeing this happen right now. I would just mention as the last major issue that we need to tackle is actually insufficient active transportation infrastructure and insufficient public transit in general. Since the pandemic, public transit operators are experiencing drop in ridership since the pandemic. right? And it's getting better and better each year, but I think we're only about 80% of pre-pandemic levels in terms of ridership for public transit operators. And this has an impact on their finances, and this has an impact on the services that they're able to offer to people living in mostly urban areas. It's again something that needs to be fixed. The funding model for these organization is broken, and we need to address that if we want people to again be able to use public transit, which is accessible to everyone, which is affordable, which is efficient, comfortable. This is the core of mobility issues in Canada.
On one hand, we have bigger vehicles and bigger and wider cities that are costing people more and more money. And then on the other hand, we have other systems, whether that be active transit or public transit, that aren't getting the investment they need that would reduce costs and reduce emissions at the same time. One element, though, is that we're kind of talking within cities too. I was wondering, I used to live in Saskatchewan, and there the loss of the Saskatchewan Transportation Company hit a lot of communities hard, as well as the loss of Greyhound in a lot of Canadian cities. I guess between cities, how does this work? Like, what's the impact of that?
Yes, it's a good point. We haven't addressed intercity mobility, transportation choices, and well, there are trains, there are buses, and it's again a lack of services mostly. The loss of intercity bus services, like yes, Saskatchewan Transportation Company, Greyhound, the loss of these services has had significant consequences for people traveling between cities, particularly in rural and remote areas. And some key impacts are increased transportation barriers, obviously, for rural and low-income travelers. Many communities lost their only form of affordable public transportation. People without access to a private vehicle, such as seniors or students, low-income individuals, people with disabilities have been disproportionately affected. When we lose, a transportation service, it also means we get limited access to essential service, reaching medical appointments, reaching education institutions, employment opportunities in urban centers. These are all examples of what people are facing when they don't have transportation options, when they can't have access to a good job just because they can't travel to it. It has a huge impact on their lives. And rural residents often must rely on expensive alternatives like taxis, ride shares, or personal vehicles if available and if they can afford it. That's what happens when they lose service like the ones we talked about. So it leads to increased isolation, social disconnection. It has economic impacts on small communities as well. Many businesses relied on these companies, on STC and Greyhound, for freight services, including the deliveries of goods and medical supplies. The closures of these services has also disrupted supply chains and increased costs for businesses in smaller towns. And I would also mention the rise of informal and riskier travel options. When you lose such a service, well, some travelers may have resorted to unsafe and unreliable methods. I'm thinking hitchhiking, which increases personal safety risks. A lack of safe and a lack of regulated transportation will disproportionately affect vulnerable populations, including women, including indigenous communities, and increasing risks of violence and risks of exploitation. This also has environmental consequences. The decline in public transit options has forced more people to rely on personal vehicles, contributing to higher carbon emissions and traffic congestion. So I think that some provinces and municipalities have attempted to fill the gap with alternative services. Some of them have turned to private operators, which have taken over some routes, but coverage is not consistent. Ticket prices are often higher than previous public services. So it's not ideal, but some of them are trying to find solutions again. There also are nonprofit and community-driven initiatives which have emerged in some areas, but they are they're often insufficiently funded and they operate on limited schedules. So again, it's not ideal. Some communities have also studied their own transportation services, recognizing the critical need for safe and reliable travel. So we're seeing these initiatives emerge in some places where bus services have disappeared, but it's not ideal, as you can tell. And I think government should recognize that we need more services across the country to link cities and to service cities in a consistent way with regular services, with services which are, again, affordable to people and which are reliable, most of all.
And I think you also sort of bridged us over to talking about solutions. I guess we've spent a lot of today talking about the problems facing mobility. Obviously, there's a lot of them, but then there's a flip side of what we can be doing. I think solutions that are already in place in our peer countries. Could you talk about what the opportunities and possibilities are for mobility in this country? What can we be doing to make it more just, more affordable, less emissions intensive?
Yes, there's a framework which we call Reduce, Transfer, Improve in mobility, which sets a priority for the most efficient actions to cut GHG emissions. And it also helps a lot with all the issues that we've discussed. So not only reducing emissions, but also making mobility more affordable to people and more accessible to everyone. And so I would just explain the framework very briefly. The first priority, reduce, is just to reduce emissions, meaning also cutting traveling distance. So our priority here is really to design living places, cities, where to densify cities to reduce traveling distance. So urban planning is key here. The second priority is transfer. We're talking here about modal shifts. So shifting between using private vehicle, for instance, to public transit, or using a bicycle to commute to work, as we said, for people who have access to bicycle lanes, for instance. So this is the transfer item, and the last priority is improve. So this is electrifying, for instance, improving the efficiency of our engines, of our transportation modes. So reduce, transfer, improve is really the framework that we should follow, and it dictates our priorities in terms of actions that we should pursue to tackle mobility challenges in the most efficient way. Reduce is mostly, again, about urban planning, about densifications to reduce distances and travel times between our homes and our workplaces, between our homes and our medical appointments, or visiting relatives, driving our kids to kindergarten. And it's urban planning is really something that we need to focus on. I think I've mentioned it before, but it's really key. Densification in urban areas is key, and if we don't understand how to do this, how to densify our cities, and how to limit urban sprawl, then we will be constantly fighting against the same problems: congestion, higher transportation costs, air quality, worsening our air quality, more stressful people commuting to work, etc., etc. And obviously, densification means bringing public transit to urban areas which are the more dense, which transportation needs are the most are higher. Urban planners and decision makers in cities and municipalities need to understand how important it is to invest in dense transit connected communities with lower emissions from long commutes. We need to expand car-free mobility options, more bike lanes, more pedestrian-friendly streets, more micro-mobility hubs. All these options make cities more accessible and sustainable. Another thing that we can do is invest in public transit as a green industry. So I explained how public transit is important to everyone living mostly in urban areas. But also, not only in urban areas, public transit should be made available to anyone in Canada. We should have a network of public transit which services people in smaller communities. We should have stronger, more connected communities with buses, with rail. And we need to understand that it's important to invest in those infrastructures and those services. We need to prioritize transit-oriented development, which is called TODS. You may have heard of this concept, and what TODS is actually how to densify urban areas. That's a major priority. And I would also mention that in the context of tariffs, and we're seeing today, we're beginning to understand how important it is to invest in our economy, and public transit is actually a way to invest in our local economy. It's a great way to invest in our economy. It generates jobs. It generates GDP. I think they did a study in America, and every $1 billion invested in public transit generates $5 billion of GDP. So it's something that we need to understand, that it's not a cost, it's an investment. The more funding goes to public transit, the better our economy will be, and the more money we will put back in people's pockets. And this is money that they will have available to help them tackle the climate crisis. This is money that will help them be stronger, more resilient. It's a key issue that we need to understand. Obviously, there are other things that a green industry strategy can do to cut the cost of living with better mobility. That's another area. Reducing household transportation costs. What we can do is expand, transit services to provide people with cheaper alternative to car ownership. We can also lower energy costs. A shift to electric transit reduces reliance on fossil fuels, shielding consumers from volatile fuel prices. And we can also create green jobs in transit and infrastructure. A strong transit workforce means stable, well-paying jobs. Again, that supports local economy. We can also, I think, use public procurement for green transit. For instance, governments could buy locally made electric buses and trains, supporting the domestic economy. I think that's basically what I would say. There are so many things that we could say, but I've given you a few ideas of what can be done to tackle our challenges in mobility.
More than enough to chew on. Thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Class and Climate is a joint production of the Green Economy Network and the Broadbent Institute. It is hosted and written by myself, Nick Pierce. Clement Nokos edited the show. Jack McClellan contributed show notes and promoted it. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed today's episode, please share it with a friend. You can find our other episodes online at perspectivesjournal.ca.